Marley was dead, to begin with. Welcome to Journey Through Time. I'm David Olusoga.
And I'm Sarah Churchwell. And this is the first of our three-part Christmas special, brought to you on Christmas Day. So Merry Christmas, David.
Happy Christmas. Yeah.
This is the first of our three-part Christmas special on the history of Jacob Marley's partner, better known throughout the world as Ebenezer Scrooge.
And the book that helped create the Christmas that we're celebrating today.
And that opening, Marley was dead to begin with, are literally the beginning words of Charles Dickens' classic tale of Christmas redemption, A Christmas Carol.
Jacob Marley is the first of the four ghosts in this famous book.
So we're going to tell the story of this famous ghost story, the story of Ebenezer Scrooge recovering his humanity. But we're also going to tell the story of the context of Christmas in 1843 as Dickens was writing. Because the fact is that when Dickens wrote that line in 1843, it isn't just Jacob Marley who was dead. Christmas was almost dead too.
Yeah, almost everything we think of as being Christmassy isn't happening. It isn't there. There's no Christmas cards. You don't even get a guaranteed Christmas day off. No Christmas crackers. There are the beginnings of Christmas trees, but mainly among kind of the royal family and German immigrants. So most of what we think of as being Christmassy isn't happening.
It was increasingly a forgotten holiday, right? So it's not a Victorian, we have a lot of traditions that we think are ancient that are actually Victorian inventions.
This is not one.
Christmas is not one of them. It is, of course, a much older holiday. But by this point, there had been kind of centuries of, feasting and midwinter festivities, but they'd been dwindling. And we'll talk about why that was. So there's still some celebration. It's not totally defunct. But as you said, there wasn't even a guaranteed day off from work. It was not a national holiday in the way that we know it by any stretch of the imagination. Whether you got Christmas Day off depended entirely on the whim of your employer.
And it's the story of the book where we're about to talk about Christmas Carol that is a key force in making the Christmas that we have today possible.
Yeah, I think this is something that a lot of people genuinely don't realize is that this isn't a story just about how, Scrooge was redeemed or how we can all discover our better nature thanks to this lovely tale, but that this is actually about Charles Dickens setting out to try to redeem England in an important way. And by doing so, he basically does reinvent Christmas.
And he shows that the joy and the communality and the intimacy of those Christmas celebrations that he is, celebrating, that he's saying we should bring these back, we should make these part of our lives. So it's a great advert for Christmas as well.
Yeah. And so we know certain kind of iconic details from A Christmas Carol. Everybody knows Bah Humbug. Everybody knows Tiny Tim. But there's a lot more to the story. So we thought that instead of arguing with your uncle about whether Die Hard is a Christmas movie,
which never can be.
Also a fine Christmas tradition, which you
I don't think it can be.
I don't think it can be either.
Though I would argue, bizarrely, that from my childhood anyway, the most Christmassy of all films was Bridge Over the River Kwai.
Okay, that is that's an unusual choice.
There's nothing specifically, obviously Christmas about Bridge Over the River Kwai, but it was on every Christmas, and I think of that as a Christmas movie.
Well, I was surprised when I moved here that for a lot of Brits, The Great Escape is a Christmas movie because that was on every Christmas. Also not an obvious, but at least it has a Christmas scene.
Yeah.
The Bridge over River Kwai doesn't even have a Christmas scene, does it?
I don't think any of these Second World War movies are obvious candidates for Christmas movies, but they were always on TV when I was a kid. So I think as a generation, think of them as Christmassy.
That's hilarious. When, of course, I grew up in America in the 70s and 80s when it was just Christmas programming wall to wall on TV. We had so many Christmas specials. I have so many nostalgic memories of specific Christmas stories, puppet stories, animated ones, we saw them all. But I really have a genuine love for A Christmas Carol, partly because, as regular listeners will know, I grew up in Chicago, and Chicago has a wonderful annual staging of A Christmas Carol at the Goodman Theater. And it started in 1978. And my mother took us there from the first or second year, certainly by the second year. And we went there every single year. And it's a really good production. It's still going on. They had the same actor played Scrooge for like 20 years. And we just always went. And only when I read the book and got to know it did I realize how faithful that adaptation is and how much of the book I had learned from watching this production. So I have a great childhood love of this story in particular.
I think millions of people who've never read the book know the story. It is a story that you just kind of pick up from, by osmosis, because it is everywhere. There's so many adaptations, so many movies that are based on Christmas Carol. I didn't read it until I was in my 20s. I was studying a master's degree in urban history and was getting obsessed with Victorian London. And of course, Victorian London means you got to start reading Dickens. And I was surprised by two things. It really is quite gothic and dark in places. And the other thing is, it was not a children's story. when he wrote it. And it has become this great part of a childhood Christmas. But that wasn't the market he was aiming for.
Yeah, and that's part of what we want to talk about over these 3 episodes is the ways in which Dickens was in a very adult and political way engaging with the social context of Victorian England at the time through this classic tale.
And even though this book isn't specifically for children, children are at the absolute center of the story and what Dickens is trying to do with this story.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point to make. So I also just wanted to add, before we get started, that there is only one person I know who I will acknowledge loves A Christmas Carol as much as I do, maybe even a little bit more. My friend Scott Jordan Harris. And I know he's listening at home, so just wanted to send special Christmas greetings to him today.
Oh, that's very sweet. Bah humbug, I should say.
Yeah, you should say bah humbug, exactly. You could play the Scrooge, and it doesn't make me Tiny Tim or something. No, I think I must be Bob Cratchit in this scenario.
The story begins in 1843, which is a kind of pivotal moment in Dickens's life where things could go in different ways. He's already famous. He's already written, 5 or 6 books? Many of his famous books have already been hits, but he's on a knife edge.
Yeah, he's at a turning point for sure. So as you say, he's very famous and he's been incredibly successful. The Pickwick Papers made him a breakout star, probably less remembered today. But then Oliver Twist, which of course everybody knows today. Another one probably that a lot of people haven't read but know,
we know the
through
story,
osmosis.
Because it's loved.
And that makes him an international star. The money starts pouring in.
And he tries to exploit that international fame by, in 1842, the year before Christmas Carol, doing a tour of the United States.
Yeah, it was huge in the U.S. The Pickwick Papers, also very, very popular there. Another Christmas story for Americans is Little Women. And in Little Women, they dress up as the characters in Pickwick Papers. And there's a big kind of opening scene about how popular that was. And that's just indicative of how he was, how he was received in America at the time.
And there are those stories of people waiting at the dockside for his new novels to arrive, knowing that a new batch of Dickens, a new novel that hasn't hit the US, is on its way, people being that excited. So he's a big figure in the States.
He's incredibly popular. And then he goes on the sold-out US tour, so everybody is excited to see him. But Dickens being Dickens, he gets very pissed off very quickly about 2 things. I don't really know which order to put them in.
Well, one I have a lot of sympathy with. as a writer, you will have the same.
I have a sympathy with both of them. Yeah, exactly. So the first one is that actually Americans kept pirating his books. They didn't have the same copyright protections then that we have today. I mean, those are sort of, we could have a different conversation about copyright today.
That should be past tense. Yeah, exactly. until AI it turned
Exactly. That was what caught me up there, is that we're about to lose all those protections. But we had a century and a half of some copyright protections, but Dickens was not yet being protected by them. So what was happening was that American publishers were pirating his books basically in front of him. So he's watching pirated copies of his books from which he's not going to make a dime being sold in front of his face, which was, insulting and he's furious about that.
He really loses it about that.
Yeah, but he was losing a lot of money, and you can understand why he was angry about it. But he's also very angry about the realities of American slavery, which he sees played out in front of him, and he's appalled.
Yeah. And he goes to the South. He sees slavery. There's a line he writes in the book that comes out of his American tour where he says he sort of thanks God that he was not a child born in a slave cradle, which is just one of the most powerful lines. But this is a British person in the 1840s. This is a few years after Britain had abolished slavery. So looking at American slavery from a British perspective and seeing Britain as kind of morally purer than America is also, we've talked about these tensions before because they come up a lot in this period. So I guess the other thing we have to say is he's also pretty rude about America.
I mean, he's not making any friends, right? So he literally gets invited to dinners while he's there and basically, sounds off about how angry he is about things. So, he's been invited by people and then insults them to their faces and says, you're all vulgar. And he went on and on about the tobacco spitting, how all they did was spit tobacco. And
American manners, he sees the Americans as cruder than the British. And he talks a lot about the hypocrisy of the Republic, that it claims all of these virtues, but it has all of these inequalities, and in particular, obviously, slavery.
And look, as we're saying, not without reason, right? And indeed, the vulgarity, not without reason. The manners were cruder in many, areas, not all of them, but many. And so then, as you mentioned a moment ago, he publishes a book about the American experience called American Notes, which is basically 300 pages of these complaints, saying Americans are all yahoos, they're thieving, they're slave drivers, they don't respect copyright, they spit tobacco all the time, they're horrible. And then he expects it to sell well in America, but strangely, it did not.
I mean, people are furious in America.
They're really offended. And this is easy to trace through the press. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
They're really, really pissed off. So basically, his second biggest market now hates him. And this is a really important precursor to what happens with A Christmas Carol, because he's riding high. And then all of a sudden, he's looking at a fall. His second biggest market in the U.S. is collapsing. They won't buy anything. Meanwhile, he's published Barnaby Rudge, a story that I think people probably don't know by osmosis. Flopped then, isn't very popular now. Followed rapidly by Martin Chuzzlewit. Another
a little
flop.
bit more popular today.
A little bit.
A bit more respected, I should say, rather than popular.
Yeah, but it's certainly not one that,
It's not one of the classics. No. It's not one of the ones you list when you think of Dickens.
No, I mean, I love Dickens and I found Martin Chuzzlewit a slog. So, if I'm an indicator, I don't know that I am. But anyway, the point is it flopped. And so suddenly he's had 3 books in a row not do well. And he's got his American audience mad at him. And his income is collapsing while he has a huge household. So he's got 5 children. His wife is expecting their 6th. He supports his parents. He supports various siblings and in-laws, her siblings, as well as his own servants. And he's paying off his father's debts. His publishers are also near bankruptcy, not least because they depend on his success for their own bottom line.
And for both of them, this has been a sudden change of fortune because he has been like a superstar, like a rocket that's taken off this kind of sensation. And it's got better and better with bigger and bigger books. And suddenly, this is the first time, he's still only 30, 31 at this point. For the first time, maybe he's not the sensation. Maybe his books aren't guaranteed hits. And it must have rocked his confidence. It clearly rocks the confidence of his publishers because they start trying to pull the rug from under him.
Yeah, their fortunes are intertwined. And if they fail, so does he. So they start to try to control what he's doing. And Dickens is not going to have that. So as the story of A Christmas Carol begins, we have to recognize that Dickens he's in a growing crisis. He really is desperate for a hit. He needs one. But as we also said at the start, Christmas itself is also in something of a crisis. So for somebody who's looking for a hit like Dickens in this moment, Christmas isn't necessarily the obvious topic to choose the way, again, it might seem today like a surefire hit. If you want to make a happy Christmas movie, make a Christmas rom-com, you want to make some money. But that's by no means an obvious choice for somebody in Dickens's position at the time. Because as we said, Christmas is in this state of neglect. I find it a little bit ironic because if you go back and look at the history of Christmas in Britain, I'm struck by the fact that, today we keep hearing from, people who are guardians of tradition that Christmas is at risk, that it's going to be canceled, that people are declaring war on Christmas.
Yeah, there's always something that's going to destroy Christmas. It's over-commercialization. It's watching TV rather than talking around the dinner table. It's political correctness. It's whatever it is.
Whatever it is. But actually it overtakes our whole society every winter. And there's no sign that Christmas is in any danger at all.
It seems pretty healthy to me.
Yeah. But in the 1840s, it really was canceled. So I was thinking, for all of those people shouting about keeping tradition alive, I'm like, well, 200 years ago, there was no Christmas. So that's the tradition you could be keeping alive. It's perfectly traditional to not have Christmas at all.
There was an old medieval tradition of Christmas.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people understand that the Christmas traditions blend older pagan ceremonies with the coming of the Christian church, which is perfectly accurate. Christmas in England stretches back to around 600 AD. And then the medieval church very happily actually kind of blends pagan and Christian customs. And so some of the words that we inherited, words like Yule, like Yule log or Yule tide, that's actually a Saxon word coming from the Old Norse for a midwinter festival. But there are also ancient Roman traditions here that are getting blended into it because Romans gave gifts at New Year's traditionally, and that's one of the ways that gift giving comes into the festivities. So there's a fascinating history of Christmas in Britain. In fact, for people who are interested, I would very much recommend the historian Ronald Hutton's wonderful book, Stations of the Sun.
I'd recommend anything by Ronald Hutton.
He's fantastic.
A brilliant historian.
And he's got a wonderful first section in that book on this kind of long history of Christmas. But basically, all a kind of amalgam of these traditions are how we ended up with our 12 days of Christmas, this extended midwinter festival that obviously runs from December 25th through New Year's and then on to 12th night. So all of those sort of are drawing on these medieval, ancient blend of traditions.
And in that older traditional Christmas, in a pre-industrial, pre-urbanized society, it was very much local. It was about villages and about local communities and lords of manors and feasts and obligations between the wealthy and the poor.
Yeah, it's rooted in agricultural rhythms and agricultural, customs and patterns.
Everything that's going to be destroyed by the Industrial Revolution that's been brushed aside in a large part by the time we get to Dickens.
Yeah. And that's really what happens, right? So you have this older tradition of, work slowing in winter. So it's dark dark days, you're not working anyway. It's not just that gathering together then becomes natural, but also as it is today, people need it to lift their spirits. So it's dark, it's cold in the north. Let's throw a party. So there are lots of traditions that develop out of that moment. Carol singing, for example, various kinds of village celebrations. The word people will know from some Christmas carols when we say wassailing. Do you say wassailing? How would you say it? Wassailing? How do you say it?
It's a word I've read but never said.
We say, in the carol, here we come a wassailing is how we sing it in America. So British listeners can correct me, but that's how I learned it. But anyway, that's begging with a cup. And like Yule, it's an ancient Anglo-Saxon word that becomes associated with these Christmas traditions.
And those traditions are then undermined in the 17th century.
Yeah. By I was going to say your friend and mine, Oliver Cromwell.
Yeah, he'd love us.
Yeah, he'd be thrilled by both of us in all of our glory. Again, it makes me laugh because the only person who actually ever declared war on Christmas was Oliver Cromwell. It's the Puritans who actually stop Christmas celebrations. In fact, they did so formally and legally. So in 1647, Parliament formally says that the Feast of the Nativity cannot be celebrated. And then on Christmas Eve in 1652, officially proclaimed that on the next day, commonly called Christmas Day, there shall be no observance whatsoever. So no church services, nothing.
And the problem here is in the name, isn't it? It's Christ Mass.
Yeah.
That's pretty Catholic.
Yeah, the Puritans aren't big fans of Mass, are they? And they understand that it has these pagan roots, and they recognize that it is actually a pagan celebration that's being dressed up in Christian trappings. And it all feels very, there's nothing very puritanical about Christmas.
It's paganism and Catholicism, not top of the favorite list for Puritans.
And it's full of joy and fun.
Yeah.
All the things they don't like.
What's not to hate?
Exactly. And the same thing happens in America. It was actively against the law to celebrate Christmas in any way in Puritan New England, and you would be fined not insignificant amounts if you were caught. So any kind of festivities. And Increase Mather, who listeners will remember from the story of the Salem witch trials, that very memorable name, he knew, as we do, that there's no connection with the birth of Jesus of Nazareth on December 25th. But in fact, the date was chosen because it lined up with the old Roman festivals. And so he said, this is actually a pagan date. And so he preached against celebrating Christmas in Puritan New England either. So that when the Restoration comes, it also restores Christmas.
So in 1660, Charles II comes back. We have the restoration of the monarchy, and Christmas is back on the menu.
Yeah, it's back as an option. But what's happened in the intervening period is that, ironically enough, the Puritans have accidentally secularized Christmas by divorcing it from any kind of church ceremony. So now suddenly the religion is falling by the wayside, but some of the secular customs have survived. And then, as you mentioned a moment ago, we're at the point in the 18th century where industrialization starts to disrupt all of these old traditions in a rapidly accelerating way.
And all of those modes of life that being tied to the land and agriculture and the rhythms of the season, all of that is the opposite of the factory system in the city.
Yeah, factories don't stop for religious festivals in this period. There are, as we've said already, there are no national holidays, bank holidays in the way that we would recognize. People are moving to cities. They're losing all of those old community connections. And all of this plays out directly in Dickens's tale, as we're about to see. So this is not just broad context. This all feeds in directly to what Dickens is doing. And meanwhile, across the Atlantic, European immigrants are also bringing their winter traditions back to life in the previously Puritan-dominated North American context. So Americans started reviving Christmas actually decades before the British did. So there's a very famous poem. I don't know how famous it is over here. 'Twas the Night Before Christmas.
Yeah, that's pretty famous. Yeah.
Okay, good. That was written in 1822. And there are other European traditions that are coming into America at the time. German families bring tree decorating, which you mentioned earlier.
And that's coming into England, really, we think from the 1790s onwards.
Yeah, but it's very spotty, as you say. It's just individual families, individual communities doing it. It's not omnipresent the way it is today. And then in America, there's a really important writer for the history of A Christmas Carol who's called Washington Irving.
Who Dickens loved.
Dickens adored Washington Irving. He's best remembered today for two short stories, The Legend of Rip Van Winkle, which is the one about the man who sleeps through the American Revolution, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which is the Headless Horseman and Ichabod Crane.
And the Johnny Depp film.
And the Johnny Depp film, which is how, if anybody today knows it, probably that's how. Washington Irving lived in England for many years. And while he was here, he learned about old English Christmas customs. And so he writes these kinds of nostalgic scenes of cozy Christmas feasting and games and good cheer by the fireside into his stories in the early 19th century.
So Christmas is being revived in the early 19th century. And we know from Dickens' own childhood that he writes about his memories of Christmas. So it is kind of slowly developing. Old traditions are slowly being brought back to life. New traditions are being brought in from Germany, from coming back across the Atlantic from America.
Yeah. And it's important to say, we don't want to overstate it. It's not that it was gone. It's just that it has nothing like the purchase that we associate with Christmas today. And that energy is starting to come back. Dickens is one of the people who has kind of active interest in reviving it because he loved it and he has these fond memories of it. And
he sees it really early, that there is something here as a writer that's really exciting, that can really touch people.
Even before A Christmas Carol, he's already writing these kinds of warm, festive stories of good cheer, and he's got them in Pickwick Papers, which we've mentioned in his early sketches by Boz. So that kind of Dickensian Christmas spirit he already has in his earliest writing.
And depictions of Christmas dinner in particular. The idea of food, the idea of the kind of communal, intimate family meal and traditions and toasts, all of that's both in Sketches of Boz, his first book, and Pickwick Papers.
Yeah. And it's worth saying, when we start talking about family, how important that will become to Dickens's conception of Christmas and by extension, how important it is to our contemporary understanding of Christmas. Because again, before then, as we said, it's a village and communal celebration, but it didn't have the iconography of family around a fireside the way that it does today. And that's partly about the rise of the middle class, which is also happening at the same time, because that is a middle class way of celebrating. So all of that is the context. And then in September 1843, as Dickens is desperate for a hit, he goes on a charitable visit. He goes to see what is called a ragged school in Holborn, in Field Lane. The ragged school is another one where the clue's kind of in the names. This is for children who are dressed in rags, literally, giving education, food, clothing, sometimes lodging, to the poorest street children.
And these are the most desperate kids. I mean, they need the food and the warmth as much as they need the education. We're almost 30 years away from the 1870 Education Act. There's no compulsory education. It's a very literate society, but if you're not literate, there's no social mobility. So giving these kids any chance or any just basic comfort, these schools, and there's about, I think, 20 of them in London by the 1840s, they really, really matter.
Yeah, basic shelter, right? So people see them as a reformist effort to try to do some good for these children. And it's important to understand the context of the ragged schools. We have to just bring in a little bit more of the kind of socioeconomic context of the early 1840s in Victorian Britain, because opinion at that point has been hugely shaped by the economist Thomas Malthus's argument that unchecked population growth among the poor will inevitably outstrip resource, and then the poor become a drain on society. So you have to do something about that. But he argued against any kind of relief for the poor because they said it would just exacerbate what they described as immoral breeding. So you just keep the population growth up, and they said it would encourage idleness among the laboring classes. So you can't have any kind of relief, or you'll just encourage all of this problematic reproduction of the poor anyway. By the 1840s, that has become, an accepted rationale, and it was the basis for the hated 1834 Poor Law.
Now, the story of the Poor Law is a series in itself. It's a kind of astonishing story. But I think most importantly, for us, it sets up the workhouse system. That if you want relief, if you are hungry, you have no job, you have no home, the only place you can get relief is inside a workhouse. And that means doing pointless, often labor, hard labor. It also means separation of families, men and women separated, even boys and girls separated, children separated from their parents. It punishes people for the act of being poor. It says, we'll stop you from starving, but we are deliberately and purposefully going to make your existence as unhappy as possible as a deterrent to others.
Yeah, punishment is the word, right? It's a deeply punitive system. And it's based on what they saw as the common sense that there's a market discipline operant here, but it becomes this really brutal calculus, which you see is just punishing poor people for being poor as if they chose it, right? As if giving people deterrence would mean they would make different choices. For the people who are pushing these policies, as I say, they think it's common sense, but the public hates it. There are riots, Chartist protests come out of this, as you say. This is an episode or multiple episodes on its own, but we have to understand this context to understand what Dickens is responding to.
The 1840s are known as the Hungry 40s. There's been a severe depression from 1837 that lasts at least to 1843. It's a period of failed harvests and political agitation. So the background is this is a really dangerous and difficult time.
And so Dickens goes to visit these ragged schools, as I say, as a charitable endeavor, because the ragged schools themselves are actually seen as an effort to reform against, to mitigate against the harshness of the poor laws. But the problem is, though the schools are well-intentioned, they're severely underfunded. And in fact, being there is not appreciably better than dying in the streets.
It's these terrible sights there.
Yeah.
I mean, these kids someone is trying to do something for them. There is an attempt to give them education and some food, but these children's lives are so incredibly harsh that Dickens is deeply affected by the kind of horrors he sees within this school.
Yeah. He calls it one of the most shocking sights he's ever seen. And we need to remember this is a man who, knows the world and has seen some shocking things by that point. He certainly did not have a coddled upbringing. And he says this is one of the most shocking things he's ever seen. Children so hungry, miserable, filthy that he can barely stand to look at them. They don't even know what a book is. They are not being taught how to read books. And he says that what shocked him the most was, and this is a quote, the dire neglect of soul and body exhibited in these children. So he has this experience which deeply shocks him. And then a few weeks later, he is giving a lecture in Manchester. It's a charity fundraiser about trying to care for deprived children, neglected children. And he speaks to these, well-meaning, well-heeled audiences about the danger to society where children are being starved, not only of food, but of education, of hope, of that nourishment of the soul that he referred to. And he says to them that ignorance and poverty are not abstract problems, that they are active dangers and they will tear the country apart if something isn't done. And he sees that this appeal about these children in the ragged school moves this audience to tears. And he said that a few nights later, he's walking through the Manchester streets. Dickens was famous for walking every night all the way through the cities. This is how he got his ideas. His books formed as he walks around the streets at
his
night.
famous night walks, sometimes 20 miles in the night, just percolating and designing his plots and inventing his characters in his mind as he walked.
Yeah, he wore out shoes, incredible, because he really, as you say, 20, 25 miles a night. And he did it not only in London. So he's in Manchester, he's walking the streets, and the idea hits him. The idea of a man who has lost all of his human compassion and has to be jolted back into a full sense of his own humanity. So it's a story that can rebuild Christmas, that can see it as a moral force, that can remind England of the compassion that it's lost.
Yeah, so Christmas Carol was born on the streets of Manchester.
In that moment.
Yeah, I love that idea.
So I think we need to take a break there. And when we come back, we will hear the story of the writing of A Christmas Carol.
Welcome back. So we're talking about Dickens and Christmas Carol and how the book was actually written. And the first thing to say is it was written incredibly fast. It was one of those furies of writing that Dickens was famous for, where he just locked himself away and built this world and made these characters. It's 6 weeks, is that right?
Yeah, which is fast even for Dickens, who was often, as you say, a very fast writer. We associate serial publication with Dickens, the idea that he was writing as he went and you would have one serial, a week or monthly, whatever.
Because lots of his books were published as chapters in magazines and you had to wait.
Yeah, to wait for the next one. Kind of like a podcast where you're waiting for the next one to come out. But unlike those, this is actually conceived as a standalone book, and he writes it as it's very short, of course, and he writes it as a standalone book. So by late November, he's done with it. It just takes the autumn of 1843. It's another one where he said afterwards that he was wandering the streets at night as the story came to him as he worked out what he was going to write, and that he was laughing and crying, and it was all kind of coming to him, and he was really bringing it to life in his head. And
the way he wrote books, I mean, Dickens was, as we'll be saying later, he was a brilliant actor. I think some of the reasons why this dialogue is so wonderful is because he acted it out and then wrote down. He would switch character and play almost perform the book as a play and then write down his performance. And so there is reports of him writing in this 6 weeks in that sort of kind of like method writing, immersed in these characters.
Yeah. As you say, the theatricality, but also that strong sense of voice. Dickens is a very voice-driven writer. You hear his voice speaking in your head as you read him. But The Christmas Carol it's a monologue. He is telling you the story, and you get Charles Dickens's personality coming through really strongly.
And there was also a certain amount of theatricality in how this book was actually physically put together, and Dickens was deeply involved in that as well.
Deeply involved. So as we were saying before the break, his publishers were on the edge of bankruptcy, and they need this book to succeed. And so they want to cut corners on the publication of it, the production of it, so that they can recoup their costs. And Dickens will not have that. The book is going to come out in late December. Obviously, it's a Christmas story, and he insists on a lavish production.
I mean, really lavish. I mean, kind of over the top for the time. Colored plates, printing of the frontispiece in two colors. It beautifully. I mean, there's those beautiful red bound original versions with the sort of green end plates. I mean, they are absolutely beautiful physical objects, but they're not cheap.
And they had gilt-edged pages, you say, these hand-colored illustrations. And this is very expensive. They are collector's items, although you can now get very inexpensive reproductions of them. They're beautiful facsimiles. So for readers who'd like to see them, there are some beautifully done ones that are very affordable.
Well, if you want an original, I mean, you're looking at £15,000, £20,000.
Yeah. But yeah, so they're beautiful little objects, and his publishers, as we said, are already struggling. So he decides that he will pay the production costs himself. And what that means is he's basically self-publishing. He can take higher royalty rates, but it also means that he takes all the risk.
Yeah. And so if it fails?
He will go personally bankrupt. I mean, he will lose everything at that point because he's right on the edge.
So it's an incredible gamble. He must have absolutely believed in this story. He'd sent out the manuscript to a few of his friends. He'd got some feedback. But you feel when you read about the writing of this book that he knew it was going to work, and he was willing to take this risk.
I think so. But also he knew he was incredibly proud of it, and he wanted it. He just had visualized it, and he wanted it to look the way he wanted it to look. And any artist or writer can understand that feeling. But then, to really complicate matters, he also insists on keeping the price down so that everyone can buy it. So he's got this very expensive object, but then he wants to sell it cheaply.
Some historians have argued that he did all of this because he wanted it to be a Christmas gift.
Yeah. And there's good reason for thinking that, but it does mean that he needs massive volume then to recoup his costs. So he throws everything he knows, everything he's learned by this point into how to write a gripping, funny, rollicking story that will work on people's hearts the way that he had seen his speech work on people in Manchester. But now he wants to not just move an audience, he wants to move the whole nation. And he's really writing the story that he thinks England most needs to hear about how we can rediscover our better selves, our compassion, our generosity.
And in this story, Scrooge really is in some ways England.
Yeah, this is how I approach this book, is that we're all so familiar with this figure of Scrooge, this weird hoarder who just needs to be brought back to be more like the rest of us. But I think the story really works the other way around.
He is Victorian Britain and everything that's wrong with it.
He is our worst selves. And the lesson is about how do we recover our best selves. So yeah, as you say, all of our listeners know this story one way or another, whether they've read the book or not. But for those who haven't read the book, we thought it might be worth having a little guided tour. Don't worry, we're not going to get completely into the weeds here, but a little bit of a guided tour into some of the really fun parts of the book. But also I think that doing this will let us look more closely at how this story connects to the world of Victorian England in 1843 that we've been talking about. So I want to begin with the fact that its full title is, I think, quite forgotten, which is not just A Christmas Carol. It's called A Christmas Carol in Prose, being a ghost story of Christmas. Now, ghost stories were part of those older traditions of Christmas that we were talking about before. We don't associate them with Christmas very much anymore, except with Dickens. But in fact, there was this old tradition of telling ghost stories around the fire in the winter. And so they had kind of melded with Christmas. But it's also a Christmas Carol in prose. He's telling what he sees as a traditional Christmas carol, a hymn to giving, to compassion, to joy, to redemption, which of course is part of the story, the Christian story of Christmas. But he's putting that in prose.
And he begins with his famous immortal character,
Ebenezer Scrooge, who, of course, is a miserly businessman who despises Christmas. And as everybody knows, he's visited by 3 ghosts on Christmas Eve who will show him past, present, and future. And the lessons of these visits convince him to change his ways. There's this famous description of Scrooge that opens it. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. That's such a great
It's lovely, isn't it?
It's a great Dickensian turn. He's just having fun, right? And he's just going to have fun with this all the way through. Now, Scrooge has total control over his clerk, Bob Cratchit's working life. He constantly threatens to fire him. He makes him work for really long hours, and he refuses even basic human needs like warmth.
Well, there's the great scene where they describe Bob Cratchit sitting at his desk.
He calls it a cell, actually, in the book.
A cell, yeah. And the door's open so Scrooge can keep an eye on him.
Yeah.
And the box where the coal is kept is in Scrooge's office. And he has a fire with one lump of coal in it. And he's trying to warm his hands on the candle because even giving him warmth is an expense that isn't worth it in Scrooge's mind.
Yeah. And so, as we said, this is the kind of type of the Victorian businessman who puts profits above all else and has this kind of, shivering, suffering man working for him, and he just doesn't care because profit is everything. Dickens's humor is always central to his storytelling. In A Christmas Carol, I think it's really important. Scrooge is funny himself. He cracks jokes, and they're nasty jokes.
Yeah, there's a lot of cynicism and just kind of skepticism.
Yeah, they're bitter jokes, but they are funny, and I think they're there partly to reveal his potential for redemption because they are human. They show that he has a sense of humor. Also, when Scrooge delivers that phrase that we all know, bah humbug, which everybody associates with Christmas now and with hating Christmas, we need to remember what the word humbug actually means, because it just means bullshit, right? So he's not saying something Christmas specific. When people say Merry Christmas to him, he is literally responding bullshit. That's what you have to hear.
That changes the tone a bit, doesn't it? When you know that.
I think it's really what you have to hear. And he says then that the only thing more idiotic than Christmas is falling in love. So he's anti-sentiment. That's what he's saying. He says this is all bullshit.
And here he's standing in for Victorian Britain, a society that's materialistic, that's rational, that is profit-driven, but has lost something about humanity and intimacy and sentiment.
Yeah, he is aggressively hostile to it. Not just has lost it, but is actively hostile to it. And so there's the famous scene when the charity workers come to the office. They ask him to give a charitable donation. Scrooge, needless to say, refuses. But he doesn't only refuse. He asks them what's happened to the prisons and the workhouses. So why should he give any charity to people if they don't have enough to support themselves? He's not going to do it. They should go to prison or they should go to the workhouse. And one of the philanthropists says many would rather die than go there.
Which shows how unpopular, how hated the Poor Law Amendment Act was.
Yeah, this is accurate, right? And again, I think that, modern listeners today might not realize that that's not hyperbole. It's literal. He's talking about how horrible the workhouses were.
Yeah. I mean, a very large proportion of the people in the workhouses are sick. They're disabled. Some of them will go there because you're dying. They were de facto hospitals at their worst, or rudimentary hospitals. Some of them had isolation wings and kind of fever wings because so many people, the only thing that could get you there is thinking that you were nearing the end, that you had absolutely no other choice. If you were in any way capable of surviving on the street or through begging or anything, it literally was designed to be the last resort. And that's how people treated it.
Yeah. And when Scrooge is told that people would rather die than go through all of that, Scrooge says, well, if they had rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population.
And that's Thomas Malthus.
That's the Malthusian language, right? The belief that some lives simply don't count, that there's surplus. But I think, again, if we make a modern analogy here, imagine being asked for, a charity appeal for people who are sleeping rough. And people say, well, the shelters aren't available or the shelters are dangerous to them for whatever reason. They're vulnerable in the shelter. And if you leave them on the street, they will freeze. And your response is, well, then they should freeze because then there will be fewer mouths for us to feed. That's what he's saying. It's that callous. It's that inhuman.
I can't forget that we are 2 years away from the start of the Irish famine, where similar ideas about excess population are going to be a factor in that disaster.
Yeah. And again, that's a Malthusian argument, right? That there are people who don't matter. You can have surplus people. The ghosts are going to show over the rest of the story the people that Scrooge is here writing off to force him and us to see them as humans.
Yeah, and to see the consequences of those viewpoints and those positions.
Yeah. So then Scrooge's nephew Fred arrives, who's this kind of fabulous, kind, good Victorian, kind of exemplary Dickens character. And he basically presents the counter case. So Scrooge is the Malthusian, and then Fred comes.
And Fred's about the last relative he hasn't pushed away. He's lost all his friends.
Yeah.
We learn later that he lost his fiancée when he was younger. Fred's about the last person who still bothers with his uncle.
I think he's literally the last person who still bothers. And he explains why. And it's actually part of his logic for why he does it is very Christmassy as well. So Fred basically delivers Dickens's moral case for Christmas and kindness in his kind of opening speech.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful speech.
It's a lovely speech.
I love this
It's
speech.
one of my favorites. Scrooge says to him, what good is Christmas? It doesn't put any money in your pocket. At the end of the year, you're no richer than you were a year ago. And Fred responds, there are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited. Christmas among the rest. It is a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time I know of when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it.
That's just beautiful.
And Bob Cratchit bursts into applause, and then he gets in trouble for that.
Fellow passengers to the grave.
Yeah.
What a beautiful
Not
phrase.
another race bound on other journeys. Not people just living completely different existences. And that's the argument of the story.
Yeah, I mean, that's the Christmas spirit.
Yeah. Exposing the errors of a society that knows the cost of everything and the value of nothing, right? And that is exactly who Scrooge is. It's also worth noting there that Fred, in that phrase that he pulled out, he speaks of people below them. Now, nearly all the film versions take that out, but his speech is specifically against the dehumanization of the poor and working class, not treating them as if they are not human beings, as if they are another race bound on other journeys. We're all human beings, we're all going to die, we're all heading in the same direction, and we should be looking out for each other. That's what Fred is saying.
2 years after Dickens writes Christmas Carol, Benjamin Disraeli, the Victorian Prime Minister, to be Prime Minister, writes his book Sybil, The Two Nations, which is saying, are we really one nation? Are the rich and the poor two separate nations? That phrase being a one nation Tory, that's where that comes from. So this idea that we are one species, one people, it is swirling around in the kind of atmosphere of the 1840s. Are we really going to allow this society to separate into like two tribes, one not caring about the other?
And that argument is one that Dickens is going to keep reiterating throughout the story. So when the ghost of Jacob Marley, who was Scrooge's business partner, appears later that night, and he tells Scrooge that he's going to be visited by three spirits, Marley actually makes exactly the same case. And I think a lot of people don't really hear it in the film and theatrical adaptations because they tend to have Marley be such a woo-woo haunting spirit that he's shouting so much that you don't really hear what he's saying.
Well, he's a terrifying figure. Yeah. His jaw falls off halfway through.
It's tied up and then he unties it and the jaw literally falls into his lap.
Yeah, and he's dragging the chains and money boxes behind him because he's wasted his life just making money and not having a life.
And he built that those are the chains that he carries with him. These are the chains that he built through this misspent life. And then he tells Scrooge that Scrooge has built the same chains but spent 7 years since Marley died, making his even longer and heavier and worse. And then Scrooge tells Marley, trying to make him feel better, he says to Marley, you were a good man of business. And Marley cries, business? Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. So again, this idea that England has lost its soul in blind pursuit of individual wealth, and now it's supernatural judgment from beyond the grave. We are getting this wildly wrong.
And Marley's function is, at this point, to set up the idea that for 3 nights that are to follow, he is going to be visited by 3 ghosts, and he names those ghosts in that scene. Scrooge says, I don't believe in you. I don't believe in ghosts. That's the pivotal moment when we know how the rest of the story is going to play out.
Yeah.
And we know we've got these 3 ghosts coming. And the first of them is the ghost of Christmas past.
Yeah. So the ghost of Christmas past takes Scrooge to visit scenes of his own life, of his past self. But the spirit's name, when you think about that name, the ghost of Christmas past, that's also an allegory. The ghost of Christmases long ago, the ghost of Christmases, of England's lost and forgotten Christmases, of all Christmases past. So he's a kind of nostalgic symbol of all the Christmases we used to have. but Scrooge is centered in them.
So he takes him to the Christmases that he used to enjoy as a boy. It takes him back to a point when he wasn't this cantankerous miser.
But these are also Christmases before that industrial change that we were talking about. So they are pre-industrial festivities because that is the time of Scrooge's youth.
So it's a different Scrooge and a different Britain.
And a different Britain. So first we see Scrooge as a young boy. He's neglected and alone at Christmas. He's left alone at school until his beloved sister Fran, who is the nephew Fred's mother, his beloved sister Fran arrives and she rescues him from loneliness and takes him home for Christmas. And of course, this establishes the importance of family at Christmas, that you shouldn't be alone, and also establishes the damage done to neglected children. Now, I think one of the most interesting things about Christmas Carol in terms of literary history is that this is actually one of the earliest stories, certainly in the English tradition, decades before Freud, that traces an adult's cruelty back to their own neglect as a child.
You know, I hadn't thought about that till I got your notes. It really is. It's Freud before Freud.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Childhood trauma shaped his life.
This is it. He frames Scrooge as a potentially good person who has been warped by loneliness, by rejection, and by economic insecurity. He's desperately afraid of being poor, which is part of what makes him a miser. But also what's really amazing about Dickens is that he intuits that revisiting those scenes with compassion for your own younger self might have therapeutic value. This is literally a therapeutic method.
It's regression therapy.
Yeah, this is a therapeutic method that people use. And Dickens intuits that this could work, that if you encourage Scrooge to be compassionate about his own younger self, it might work on the adult man to be kinder.
I hadn't thought of any of that until I got your notes. It's so interesting.
Dickens is amazing. We're going to do all kinds of stuff on Dickens. Then we see Scrooge as an apprentice, which is maybe 40 or 50 years before the story of Christmas Carol takes place.
So in the 1790s, we're still in the Industrial Revolution, but it hasn't taken off the way it's going to by 1843.
Yeah. So Dickens is imagining this nostalgic, warm Christmas. I imagine much the way that we might set a Christmas today if we want to tell this kind of story in the 1950s, right?
It was always an age of innocence. It was always 50 years in the past.
Roughly,
Every society has that.
Exactly.
Though the Victorians had a point.
And for them, it's the 1790s. So Scrooge's, he has this kind and jolly boss who's called Fezziwig.
A classic, ridiculous Dickensian name.
It's wonderful. And Fezziwig throws a Christmas party. And one of the things that's lovely about his Christmas party is that it makes no distinction between the people who work for him and his own family. So he's blending, so the sense that all of his apprentices are welcome in his family. They're part of a family.
And that's going back to those pre-industrial, almost medieval festivals where it was about community and village life and masters and servants coming together. That description of Fezziwig's party is, look what we have lost.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And so he shows the warehouse bursting into life. He's got fiddle music and dancing and laughter and drinking and toasts, and it's all great fun. And then the ghost points out to Scrooge that this party that's making them all so happy was not actually very expensive. And Scrooge says the happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune.
So he's already beginning to be turned.
The lesson is starting to land. And in the book, Scrooge is explicit about this. He actually says he wishes he could speak to his clerk, to Bob Cratchit, because the penny's starting to drop. And then we see a slightly older Scrooge with his fiancée, who you mentioned before, and she's breaking their engagement.
This is a great scene because in some ways this is the kind of fork in the road. She has seen which way his life's going to go. And the opportunity to have a fuller, more human, more intimate life is lost at that moment when she leaves.
Yeah, it absolutely is a crossroads for him. And she says to him the reason that she's leaving, she says, "Another idol has displaced me, a golden one." And then she says, "I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you."
So it's just money. That's all you care about now.
But again, I think this is really important because it shows that he was nobler once, that he did have higher dreams and higher aspirations. They've just fallen by the wayside. So again, we can see that there's a redeemable human in there somewhere.
And the ghost hammers this home by taking him to see the life that Belle has had after leaving Scrooge, happily married with children. This is the life that he could have had he not put everything about money.
Yeah. And that scene is often cut from theatrical adaptations, but I think it's really important to the book. And again, this is that allegory, right? So Victorian England has turned away from its higher aspirations, its higher ideals, and is chasing only money. And then comes the Ghost of Christmas Present.
He's a kind of jollier figure.
Yeah, much jollier. So he's a giant in a green robe on a throne of food. And this is a celebration of plenty. He's often figured with a cornucopia.
So this is the tradition of the feast, another thing that's been lost, another thing that was cast away in this kind of drive for growth and industrialization and urbanization. He's a kind of figure that says, again, this is what we used to have. We can have it again.
Yeah, this is the feast day of medieval England, right? That's how it sounds. Sounds very Henry VIII to me. Or, that kind of...
and he's a kind of jolly figure. He's kind of bare-chested in a green robe. He's sort of, he's linked to figures that exist around Christmas with the green robe. But,
And he, in most film versions, he takes Scrooge only to see the Cratchits have their Christmas.
This is Bob Cratchit's family, his clerk.
His clerk. And he also goes to see his nephew Fred. In the book, they actually go all over the world, and he visits all of these scenes of people who don't have very much money, but are finding warmth and good cheer and making a Merry Christmas for themselves.
He sees workers in a mine. He sees all of these people who...
Sailors.
Are less fortunate than him, but are having this kind of beautiful, intimate day that he's not.
That he's lost. And so he sees all of the human warmth that he's lost. And then he sees Fred, his nephew Fred, at home at the center of this jolly Christmas gathering that's full of games and warmth and all of this good cheer. So he's very much got his nose pressed against the window, in some versions, literally, but certainly figuratively.
And he doesn't just see their Christmas, he hears what Fred, his nephew, says about him.
Yeah. And this is Fred explaining why it is that he's the only person who keeps hope in Scrooge, that he keeps hoping Scrooge will do better. And it's because he says his mother, Fran, Scrooge's sister, loved him, and therefore he knows there must be some good in him. And then he says, his wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself always. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something.
And Scrooge in this scene is shocked to hear how he's spoken about. When he witnesses all of these scenes, he begins to realize how other people think of him. And that's kind of part of his awakening.
Yeah, I mean, this is also a case for enlightened self-interest, right? That Scrooge's greed is primarily harming himself. Yeah, it's harming Bob Cratchit, but mostly it's not harming anybody else. But it's ruining his life. And that generosity isn't weakness. It's actually a wisdom. And then comes the Cratchit household, Bob Cratchit's house, and this is the emotional heart of the story on Christmas Day. Bob carrying Tiny Tim home from church, and they have the small goose that they treat like a royal roast. They're a large and hungry family. It's not anything like enough food. They're dreadfully poor, but they're loving and they're warmed by their affection.
Tiny Tim is one of the ways in which this book is about children.
Yeah, he's the first of several important children in this story. Tiny Tim is, of course, frail and disabled. He's innocent. He's grateful. He's angelic.
His little crutches are leaned up against the fire. Dickens knew how to twist the knife with sentimentality, and the Victorians were an easy mark in terms of sentimentality. But it is brilliant the way he makes this. The scene of him being carried in on the shoulders by Bob, and his description, the tiny things that have made him feel happy.
Yeah. And then Tiny Tim gives that famous blessing, that Christmas blessing that we all love. People now kind of mock.
I'm going to start crying now.
I know. People mock it today, but it is really
beautiful.
lovely.
It is
so
lovely.
The family says, God bless us. And Tiny Tim just chimes in, God bless us, everyone. I'm going to start crying.
It's so beautiful.
Because that's the message, right? It's about every human. Every single human.
This book's almost 200 years old and it's still...
I know, it's making us cry. And as you said, Dickens is really weaponizing sentiment here, but it's so that he can really have his powerful response to that Malthusian argument that we were speaking of earlier. Because Scrooge asks the ghost if Tiny Tim is going to survive.
Yeah.
And the ghost indicates that he won't. And then he throws Scrooge's own cruel and inhuman argument back in his face. And he says, well, if he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population.
He repeats his own words back to him.
Yeah, flinging them in his face. Exactly. Yeah. You said that people like Tiny Tim were expendable, that they should just die. Well, this is what that means in human terms.
Yeah, for an individual.
For an individual, for a family.
For the son of somebody you spend every working day with.
For a family, for an individual, for that little boy who is moving you, and you said earlier that he didn't matter. And this moment is basically the precise midpoint of this perfectly structured little book.
I didn't know that. Yeah. So this is the pivot.
This is the emotional peak. Tiny Tim's life hanging in the balance. Scrooge beginning to soften and to see the error of his ways. It's the midnight world turning toward Christmas morning. It's the emotional crest that Dickens needs readers to feel on Christmas Day itself.
So this is the moment he's going to get them with this book. This is the moment, This is the passage in which there is no return from. You are sucked into this book by the time you reach that midpoint.
Yeah. So Dickens has bet everything on this story.
Personally, financially, in career terms, everything.
Everything. And now it's about to go out into a nation that has forgotten what Christmas can mean. So that's the biggest gamble of all, right? Is not can Scrooge find his soul, but can Britain.
And Dickens is overdrawn at the bank. And as we'll be saying in a later episode, that has real emotional significance for him. This is a terrifying prospect. This book is going to work or it's going to fail. If it fails, he's bankrupt.
So the book will come out on December 19th, 1843. And join us next time to hear about Scrooge's redemption and Britain's reaction and how one short book changed Christmas forever.
Wonderful. Well, Merry Christmas. Thank you for listening.
And Merry Christmas to everyone from us all here at Journey Through Time.